Good afternoon and welcome to our parallel session. We are delighted to share with you our insights regarding ethics and privacy. During our session, we will dedicate a little space to give the audience insights about how to fulfill GDPR. Second, Dr. Pickering will illustrate us about one of the main concerns for a research on clinical environments. We are talking about the consent and about the processing of data fulfilling the artificial intelligence ethical principles. After this, Alex Sanders, share with our audience the problems that he solved, the insights obtained applying privacy-enhancing technologies. Finally, Dr. Noordergraaf will illustrate us regarding the main concerns about ethics and privacy from the clinical perspective. All of us will share with the audience a take-home message. Let me start. I will try to summarize in a brief comment the main concerns regarding fulfilling GDPR. But let me say one main thought. We are dealing with patients. We are protecting people. And this is really relevant. We have to apply a human-centric approach where patients are the most important persons to be protected. From this point of view, we have to deal with a very complicated legal landscape. To deal with that, we have to apply a lot of soft law guidelines. Let me say that this is one of the main problems because we have to deal with GDPR, we have to deal with Open Data Directive, we have to deal with national laws in Spain, France, Germany, and so on. But at the end of the day, we have to read and to apply the provisions of Data Protection Authority. The European Data Protection Board, ancient working Article 29, Spanish Data Protection Agency, United Kingdom, ECO, the Information Commissioner. There are practically 28, if we consider UK, Data Protection Authority providing us guidance about how to fulfill GDPR in a research environment. And believe me, these guidance are law, are the real law to be applied. From that point of view, a GDPR compliance workflow is really well known. There is different steps, identifying the conditions of processing, implementing a risk analysis, developing different data protection legal strategies regarding transparency, contracts, legal binding obligations, international data transfers. For every DPO in the world, how to fulfill GDPR is really easy. It's a workflow defined by GDPR itself. But this is relevant to underline the main problems we identify in our kind of projects. I think you have to see the upper side of my slide because probably the most important questions regard, firstly, to identify the roles of partners and third parties. In BigMedilytics, we are 35 companies or entities in different countries. We have controllers, joint controllers, processors. We have entities processing anonymized data, and we have to provide them with data sharing agreements. It's really complicated to deal with this kind of complexity. And this is compulsory. And where you have identified roles, purposes, and responsibilities, you have to identify the main authority. And you have to identify where you are processing data. And you have to know if, okay, my data probably will be in Israel or United States, or this is really difficult in this kind of project. But from my point of view, there are different main questions. To do that, we have to wait till this year, on July, to have guidance for European Data Protection Board to do that. They provide a model to identify roles of different entities or companies in a common processing. Okay, let me say, this year we are dealing with that the last 5 years without any help. And remember that, if you read this document, you will see that in case of joint controllership, you have to deal with a contract not only in the terms stated by Article 26, this regards to the basic obligations regarding data subjects from each controller, but you have to implement a general and a really stressing contract regarding each responsibility, each processing, security measures, trust on each part, and so on, and so on, and so on. Then it is a real challenge. Second big challenge, data protection by design and by default. Let me say that Alex Sangers will explain us practically immediately a very well example of data protection by design. It means that we have to train our teams, we have to apply GDPR from the very beginning of the project. And please retain this main thinking. While you are thinking on your new research, apply data protection by design. This is really relevant. And in the other hand, remember that you have the EDPB guidelines, you have the help of Norway Data Protection Authority, Spanish Data Protection Authority provide guidance, AENISA provide guidance. You have a lot of guidance to be read and to be applied. Second, and really relevant, in one pilot of our investigation, we use mobile applications. Let me say that we could think on mobile application, but we could think on Internet of Things, wearables and sensors, devices. And in that case, we have to develop a specific impact assessment and a specific data protection by design way to approach to that, because we have to apply not only GDPR, but the communications, the privacy in communications directive. It means that we have to be conscious about the permissions that the wearable or the mobile application needs. We need to develop a special layer of transparency. Remember, a patient reading in a phone, it's a really difficult effort. We have to consider the device requirements, and not only in order to fulfill GDPR, because if it is considered a medical device, there is a regulation now into force that must be applied. And it has a very deep influence on the designing and of the testing of the product. Anonymization. What I can say about anonymization. Remember, if you have attended all of our presentations, yesterday I said that, okay, in GDPR, they talk about reasonable effort. Today, EDPB said us that it means irreversible anonymization. You said Thomas Serdick from EDPS said that. And we have to consider the risk of re-identification over the world by any person, by the best mathematician of the world. It's a really strong effort to apply that. At the end of the day, we have to deal with anonymization, pseudonymization, and we have to provide a proper anonymization. Then, of course, it is really difficult to apply a double layer of anonymization. And here you have, in my presentation, different additional guidelines. Okay, I have to anonymize, but how can I do that? Following the recommendation of the EDPB? Or applying the Spanish DPIA methodology? Or IRIS? Or AENISA? Or everyone? what the criteria will be for all. It's the same regarding DPIAs. Okay, we deal with DPIAs applying Article 35 of the GDPR. But during the life of our project, there were published different national lists about how to implement a DPIA, different criteria to decide if you need to apply that. But except in Portugal. In Portugal, there are not a list till today. And you have to deal with national culture, with national requirements. Let me say only a final thing. Now, who is talking is not BigMedilytics. It's Ricard Martínez as a professor and as a researcher. Then, my words don't compromise the project. It's my opinion. We need a common and specific policy framework for data-driven research. It's really difficult to do that in our actual conditions. This is practically impossible. We need to adopt a common framework, define a concept of public interest, facilitating the use of data for research, avoid the confine of valuable data, who remains at the hospitals, who remains in the property of somebody. It's really difficult to consider that we have to promote European codes of conduct or certifications. At the end of the day, we need to develop a very strong healthcare research area in the European Union. And to do that, we need data, certainty, and common rules. We are not talking about infringing the right to privacy of people. We are not talking about to cause a harm. We are talking about competitiveness of our healthcare sector. We are talking about how to implement data analytics for primary uses. And for that, we need a common approach. It's really difficult, it's so expensive. It means that we have to invest a lot of time and people to implement projects like BigMedilytics. And this is not possible. This is my desire, intuition. I don't know how to qualify that. Please, legislators and DPAs and authorities have to wear in our shoes, how to put in our place, how to feel like us when we are trying to research and we have a lot of challenge to pass to do that. Then, my take-home message, by applying GDPR, we will protect patients. But let me say that we need a better version of GDPR to do that. Then, Dr. Brian Pickering, dear Brian, it's your floor. Please say me when you need to pass this slide, please.
Thank you, Ricard. Can I have the first slide, please?
It's that?
Okay, I can't actually see any slide, but never mind.
We practically can't hear you.
Sorry? Ah, there we go. Thank you. And thank you for what you just said about the GDPR, about regulation, etc. And I'd just pick up, as I go into this section, on a couple of things that you said both today and yesterday. You know, this is about protecting patients. They are the most important people. And we don't just have a regulatory responsibility, in my opinion, to protect them. We also have an ethical responsibility. So it's not just privacy, it's about doing the right thing for them. But in talking about consent specifically, you mentioned yesterday morning, Ricard, about different member states using derogations to implement different things in different countries. So in France, for example, consent for retrospective studies is much easier and possible, whereas for progressive, it's less tangible. And so we have a lot of issues around consent and what it means that we need to think about. So the first thing here, if we think in the context that we've all been working on in BigMedilytics, namely about providing healthcare, providing all of the services around healthcare, and to improve the use of resources. Consent really refers to a patient's willingness to undergo an intervention or to take part in a trial, to use whatever. And that's really important and it's central to what we've been trying to do. Next slide, please. And this is based on an assumption that the main relationship is between the patient on the one hand and the clinician on the other hand. So the patient is happy to trust that the clinician wants to do the best for them, and so they will engage and they will provide, in this case, consent. There is, however, a bigger ecosystem behind that. There's the community looking on to make sure the patients are treated well. There are patient advocates who will represent the patients. And of course, there is regulation around medical practice. But this is a simple ecosystem, and it's based on this trust relationship between the patient and the clinician. Next slide, please. However, consent has been used and misused in many different areas. Consent in data protection, of course, is just one legal basis for why the data subject, in this case the patient, would actually be prepared to divulge or to share their personal data or their special category personal data. And of course, we have to comply with the law. There is no choice around that, but we need to be sort of fairly careful about what we're expecting people to do and their understanding. Now, Alex, of course, will explain how we can actually use different mechanisms behind that. Gerrit-Jan will finish off with bringing it all together. But that's the basis. However, in a healthcare environment, consent means something different. Using technology, and of course, a lot of the pilots use different pieces of technology. Consent is assumed to be the willingness to agree to the terms of use of that technology. There's a lot of case law in the US where people have not read it and yet been bound by those terms. And then finally, we have research participation. Consent here simply means that the participant is willing to engage in a research project or task, and tends to be bound in the Belmont report about research and what is appropriate. Now, the interesting thing on research participation is that research will actually cater for deception. Not altogether, but there is the provision there. So basically, informed consent, depending on where you're coming from, means different things to different people. And of course, from the patient point of view, because as Ricard said, we want to protect the interests of the patient, it's not always the case that they will understand this. Next slide, please. Because already when we're getting into medical research, the network starts to increase. We have medical research there on the far right, but again, the patient will tend to say, I trust you, doctor, so therefore, if you want me to take part in this, if it's going to provide benefit for the rest of the community, and we've seen this in a number of the pilots that we've talked about over the past couple of days, then I'm happy to share my data, I'm happy to engage. Next slide, please. However, and this is certainly the case for the pilot, which I've been most heavily involved in, the networks of the ecosystem starts to expand quite dramatically. In our case, we have a decision supports system, which is helping the clinician to make decisions about the condition of their patients. But that's based on science, a completely different discipline from medical research itself. And we also have a piece of technology in there, the monitoring app, I've called it here, which is developed by a developer who uses, who's used to IoT, who is used to smartphones, etc., for the patient to be able to input certain types of their data. And now it's more difficult when the patient says, I trust you as my clinician, and therefore I'm prepared to give consent. So in the previous slides, we said, well, we have to be clear what consent means, but now the clinician is not in a position to be able to say they understand the whole ecosystem. they understand what's going on in all the different components. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about consent and we're thinking about the patient, we have to be, certainly as researchers, as social scientists, as law professors, as clinicians, we have to recognize that the fundamental relationship we are dealing with in BigMedilytics and indeed healthcare in general is this trust relationship based between the clinician and the patient. And that's an ongoing negotiation. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the clinician may get it wrong, but the patient will accept that provided this relationship is strong. Next slide, please. And so basically we have to, as we introduce the different components within the ecosystem, we have to make sure that the oversight understands, so the regulators, the community, the patient advocates understands this basic relationship, and that they take on board what happens when we introduce medical research alongside data science and technology development. We've summarized all of this in that reference that I've given there, but the important thing is to remember that this is a trust-based relationship. Next slide, please. Now, Ricard was giving at the end of his talk some of the different guidance which is provided. The higher level interest group on ethics has actually come forward with this assessment list to look at different aspects of technology. What you'll notice here, so the boxes in grey are the high level items, the dependent items falling off that in white are the different question areas within the checklist. So you go through these to make an assessment of your technology. It's a bit like a DPIA, but it's not, if you see what I mean. The guy from the commission this morning was talking about the development of AI guidance, and this is one part of it. The most important thing, though, about this checklist is, as you'll see, it talks about issues like society. It talks about issues like human agency. So what people understand and what they can do, what they can take responsibility for. So if you think about the clinician, it's unfair to expect the clinician to take on responsibility for everything. So these kinds of checklists and this guidance will help us as developers and in fact as technicians, as psychologists, as clinicians, to understand what we need to look at in the advanced technologies that we're developing. The next slide, please. So I took this, and the red box is really, so that's the only thing which deals with privacy, if you like. The rest of it is all about technology. The rest of it is all about how the ecosystem works and how we give the main stakeholders, and especially the patient, assurance that they're going to, that what they're using is appropriate. The yellow blobs are really things which technology developers deal with all the time. The little numbers are my assessment of one of the pilots that I know quite well and where we fit. So one of the messages there is within BigMedilytics, a lot of this is due to Ricard and his oversight of what we've been doing. We've kept close to these principles as best we could to develop appropriate technology. And the green boxes here, like environmental well-being, etc., are the things where these technologies will really help. And so moving forward, we need to make sure that the patient is comfortable, that they understand this. So there's the stakeholder participation, which includes the regulators, of course, but that also needs to be at the bottom there, a lot of communication. Next slide, please. And this is my take-home message. You know, everybody in this ecosystem, but especially the patient, because we're about protecting the patient, but also the clinician, has a right to know what's going on. So we need for this to maintain continual and open communication, because ultimately it comes down to trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pickering. Now, Alex Angers, is your floor.
Thank you very much. So I'll tell something about the privacy and data protection we developed within one of the pilots using multi-party computation. So next Next slide, please. So in pilot 5, the heart failure pilot, we were involved to look at some data sharing challenges. And I'll take you through this example to show you how we came to a design for dealing with this problem. The first thing is that we looked at what is now the goal of this data sharing collaboration. And actually the goal of this is that there's a health insurer company and a hospital that would like to combine their data in order to come up with high-risk patients that they can identify that could benefit from an healthcare intervention. That's the goal. And the mean that we would like to achieve this is by a prediction model where this data set is combined of both data sets, of both organizations. So the problem, as has been discussed also by Ricard and by Brian, is of course that it's not easy. You cannot just say you can share these data sources between these organizations because of ethical but also legal issues. And one of the GDPR principles that of a couple of GDPR principles are, for example, data minimization or proportionality, and also data protection regulate actually how this data sharing should take place. So what we have been looking into is privacy enhancing technology, and the one that we have been developing in this specific use case is multi-party computation. Well, yeah, next slide, please. So first of all, it's good to identify that sharing the data is actually not the goal of a collaboration. So if you look at the problem, you have sharing data, and that it looks like to conflict the privacy and the confidentiality of the involved data. But that's actually not the case. If you go to the next slide, then actually the idea of this collaboration is the added value of collaboration. So you want to have value, get value from the data, and not the data itself is not the goal. So, and if you go to the next animation, then that's actually the promise of privacy enhancing technologies. You have a couple of them, as I explained, and I will dive into if we go to the next slide, into what multi-party computation can mean. So what actually is this technology? So it's actually a toolbox, you could say, of a couple of techniques that use cryptography in order to be able to decentralized analyze sensitive data without explicitly sharing it. So you have to imagine that you are cooperating with a couple of parties, and each party has input data that is confidential. For example, personal data can be sensitive patient data. And these organizations would like to couple this data, but it is actually sensitive, so they cannot share that. And the idea with this multi-party computation is to use cryptography in order to protect the data. It's advanced cryptography that only the result of a certain analysis can be revealed and can be shared. Well, one of the disadvantages of this technology is, of course, you have to take this into account upfront, and this advanced cryptography also come with a longer computation time. So you have to really think through on how to achieve data protection and privacy by design this way. Next slide, please. So if we look at the pilot that we have been involved in the heart failure pilot number 5, then what we see on the left side is actually on a high level the setup on how you could analyze the data. So we have to imagine that there are, in this case, 3 different servers that are being used as a computation. And so there are 3 servers that are decentralized, analyzing the data that is both provided by Erasmus MC, the hospital, and Achmea, the health insurance company. And at the end, if you look at the right side, then what you see is that in this small example, you have all these dots, which are patients, and the data is distributed among 2 different organizations. And all these dots represent features on the horizontal and vertical axis that actually only are known to one of those two organizations. So the data is not combined in essence. And this should be private. It should not be shared between the organizations, but the results, so the prediction model, the relations between these kind of features, that is the interesting part. So these dots, these patient data, that is not interesting, but we are interested in the red line, the prediction model that is being developed from this patient data. And that's actually what is being computed with this approach. Next slide, please. So there are two steps in this. The first, so there's some data processing on both the two organizations that provide data. There's also another third party involved, which is actually also one of the external exploitation partners in the BigMedilytics project. And they cooperate as well. They also do not get insight in the data. They cannot. It's cryptographically protected, the data. And the idea is that what we did in a pilot is that we first couple the data in the secure inner join part. That's the first part where we use multi-party computation. And when this data is coupled in a decentralized fashion, then the second step, the second part, is to come up with a lasso regression analysis, which is a machine learning approach in which the relations between these two data sets are explored, and the result is projected here as an example. Next slide, please. So we developed a proof of concept using first, we developed this on fake data. So you can see that we have 3 servers, one somewhere in West Europe, was a cloud, somewhere in the cloud. Then Zorg DPIA had a server in Frankfurt, and Erasmus MC, the hospital in Rotterdam. And we use this distributed computation in order to come up on synthetic data with this setup. And only the parties could only learn the aggregated prediction model. So no personal data is revealed during this whole setup. Next slide, please. Well, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, that also the performance is always a challenge because of the encryption that is added to it. So we also identified so to what extent this is scalable. And what we saw is that in our experiments that we are able to do this secure lasso regression with the inner join as well, and able to evaluate 10,000 patients with 10 features within half an hour. And that's actually to train a prediction model, to come up with this prediction model, which can then be used in practice, of course, very fast. But the training takes half an hour in this case, and that's is deemed acceptable. So that's a nice result. So this can be used in practice on real data in the future as well. Next slide, please. So, taking one step back, so this was a little bit about the technology, but how does this help? If you are looking into the GDPR compliancy, for example, well, what we see is that this approach can create all kinds of opportunities for research projects, and it really contributes to the GDPR principles, as I mentioned before. So what you can prove with this is you can technically make sure that you comply with GDPR with respect to data minimization, proportionality, and data protection. Also, it forces you in a specific way to think, because due to this implementation, you have to implement it with technology as well. You are very well equipped for writing up a data protection or privacy impact assessment, as Ricard was also mentioning. One note is, of course, if you're looking into the grounds that you need, you still need, if you're using these kind of privacy enhancing technologies, you still need a ground before processing personal data. So even anonymization is actually is a processing of personal data before it is anonymized. So it's good to know. Well, this is actually the technology is as shown here is ready for application on real life patient data, and that's also what we're going to do in a follow-up project, also a European project, Secure eHealth, with amongst others participating again also Achmea, Erasmus MC, ZorgTTP, TNO, and a lot more, and also it's an international project with quite some countries involved. So. That's the next step. Next slide, please.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, I think my main message was skipped, but
yeah,
it's.
Yeah, we'll see it at the end.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. We've talked about the legalities. We've talked about the basis in law. We've talked about the community, which actually assesses what we're doing, and a high level but practical way to go about with dealing with data. But now let's take it back to the hospital. Let's go back to Pilot 9, which dealt with a workflow analysis using RTLS in patients suspected of having a stroke. Okay, so Pilot 9 we've talked about before. Okay, the ED is a busy place. There's a lot of things going on. Getting real good data out of such a confusing area using EMR is particularly difficult. We got about 830 patients included in a 12-month period, even though COVID didn't really help. But most of the work was done up front before we actually started inclusion. And Griffin and co-workers actually looked into the use of RTLS and defined spheres which interfere with privacy awareness. And we always talk about the patient. However, a lot of our work was geared towards convincing the professionals, the nurses, the physicians, the technicians, that patient following, and thus following professionals, was okay, was safe, and was useful. That it's not always simple is perhaps best exemplified by the information that my coworker received just before April Fool's Day, in which somebody whispered to him that the nursing staff was planning to send around an email saying that the RTLS badges were registering the amount of sit-down time. And that any day now they were expecting to get a nice large poster in which these times would be reported such that they could be discussed within the group. Of course, with a degree of anonymity, but how far that was to remain unclear. You could imagine that we as project group were slightly less than enthusiastic about this idea, and I'm happy to report that in the end it didn't fly. Okay, so in the whole study, all the patients were willing to participate and were included with informed consent, with 2 exceptions. But the professionals was where most of the work was. There's not a lot of data out there about this specific application, and the professionals don't do very well. Let me see if we can get the next slide. Yes. Okay, so let's see how this all balances. Well, Pilot 9 was a study. We knew when it was going to start. We knew it was going to end. We could tell the professionals that. We had very clear-cut goals, and we got people involved early to talk to the stakeholders about where their concerns were. We were able to do concessions. The individual professional was not recognizable. The group of neurologists were a group. However, one neurologist has on call 24/7. So there's a roster which would identify that person if we were going to look back in a time-sensitive fashion. And that's certainly possible, but the RTLS technique doesn't support that, and we had no intention of doing that, and we were in fact able to convince most of the people that this wasn't going to happen. Okay, but real functional anonymity is a real problem. For generalized use, it becomes even more difficult, since one of the things we hadn't thought about was you need a maintenance schedule. And to be able to maintain badges and asset tags, you need to know who has what. We noticed in our interim analyses that sometimes badges didn't show up in places where they had to be. So they were either not working or not being worn. It was very hard to tactfully approach people to see if the badge was not functioning, and some of them were not, or whether they had objections or had just forgotten the badge or had a different white coat or whatever. Okay? So that's a real problem. Now, in acceptability, reciprocity, the idea that if I help you, you will help me in some future case, is good for research projects, but works very badly if you're going towards generalized use. Between the patient and the professional, other things also play a role. Okay? When we set up the project, we went to the data protection officer, we went to the legal counsels in the hospital to ask what their opinion was on what we could do. We actually went and asked if the professionals all had to give informed consent to wear a badge, and what we should do if somebody said, no, I'm not going to. Okay, and that was very difficult, and it's not in the contracts, even though most of the contracts for both nurses and physicians require that you participate in quality assessment projects. Okay? So we accepted that there was simply a right to refuse. It was, after all, a trial. And in our interim analysis, we think that we have 70 to 80% compliance in wearing badges by the professionals during the course of the study. And we hope that at the end of the study, these numbers will be confirmed, but we're not really sure. And going to individuals and asking if they're wearing badges is very much on the cutting edge of what would be acceptable as privacy interventions. So what are these user aspects? Okay. Define your goals. Let the stakeholders understand that these goals are manageable and that it's worth the effort of wearing the badge, of tagging the patient, of doing whatever is necessary. Strive for anonymity in as far as that is possible, and de-identify what you cannot do confidentially. Okay? Remember that our TLS data is a series of numbers, 0 and 1s. Okay? There's no link to rosters. There's no calculation necessary. It's, in and of itself, data without context. Okay? People are really scared of Big Brother, and people who are happy in their job, less so than people who are unhappy in their job or who feel that they might be given criticism on how they perform their job. But we don't know who's who, and in fact are not interested in that anyway. But it needs to be used in such a way that it's safe for both of these categories. People don't need to be reminded that their smartwatch or their smart telephone is reporting their presence continuously. They probably know they're at some place, and we're not going to tell them that the electronic medical record knows how well they type, and that data is available, or when they go into the parking place at the hospital, that the hospital can actually check and see what time you booked in on that particular day. Okay? That only makes things worse. That perception of privacy is essential. Think about a maintenance strategy. Think about a way to get to individuals, perhaps via an outside party, which would be safe and which would be GDPR acceptable. And my coworker had a fine system involving food and high sugar loads. periodically dropping by and saying, okay, things are going well, and here's something to eat, works really well, even if GDPR doesn't necessarily support that directly. So we're working on a template, working through the literature, and in our final report, we hope to be able to give you that template, that if you're ready to implement a system such as RTLS, that you can learn from the obstacles that we had to deal with and benefit from that experience. So my take-home message would be communicate, 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 start really early, and continue strenuously until well after you're done. And there's no reason to be afraid of your brother if you can deal with him, if you understand him. Thank you.
Okay. Many thanks to all of you. Please, Alex, here it is your main thought. I read that privacy-enhancing technologies such as MPC can contribute to GDPR compliance when data sharing challenges arise. We only have 2 minutes, and I need 3 absolutely quick shots. Brian, for you, it is possible the development of data donors initiative by healthcare systems? Alex, are you confident in technology to promote the fulfillment of GDPR? And Dr. Noordergraaf, feel your staff comfortable at the end of the day with the processing of data? Please, be quick. Brian.
Yes and no. Is that quick enough? Yes, the patients will generally provide their data if it's going to be of benefit and they understand why it's being used. I'm slightly more concerned because that's the whole issue. They need to understand what's going to happen to their data and why it's being used. But if they do, then they're very willing. So yes, I agree in principle with data donors.
Alex?
So yeah, I think that the basis of a data-driven approach. I mean, researchers just want to research and they want to get on with the data. I think that if you apply privacy-enhancing technologies and you have clear goals, are very transparent on how you achieve your privacy and data protection, and what you're going to do with the data, then I think that yes, privacy-enhancing technologies can aid researchers in achieving what they are interested in, and that's about the research results.
And you, Dr. Noordergraaf?
My answer would be yes, and I think that the 70 to 80% compliance rate supports that.
And then many thanks to be here with us. I enjoyed a lot with your speakings. I think, I expect we will be useful for our audience. Many thanks, and push on GDPR nothing.